The sign said, "Debt Settlement, all assets included," and Nora didn't realize until she was standing in the mud, her wrists bound with rope, that she was one of the assets. It was the kind of morning that made the Wyoming Territory feel like the edge of the world. The sky hung low and colorless over the little trading post town of Caldwell Flats, and the frost hadn't melted off the hitching posts by 8 o'clock. Nora had been awake since before dawn, listening to the men outside her father's store argue about numbers she didn't understand, figures scrawled in ledgers she'd never been allowed to see. Her father had been dead 3 weeks. The debts, apparently, had not died with him, the man running the settlement. A thin-necked creditor from Cheyenne named Aldous had the kind of voice that sounded polite while saying terrible things. He'd explained it to her the evening before, with his hat held in both hands like he was standing in a church. "Your father signed papers, Miss Nora. Everything in the store, everything he owned, the building, the inventory." He'd paused there, long enough that she'd known what was coming, and his dependents. She hadn't understood it the first time he said it. She understood it now. There were maybe 40 people gathered in the flat-top patch of dirt between the livery and the general store. Some of them she recognized. Caldwell Flats was small enough that she'd sold half of them their flour and their lamp oil. They weren't looking at her the way people looked at a neighbor's daughter. They were looking at her the way people look at a horse being walked out of a stall. Aldous climbed up on the wagon bed and cleared his throat. There was a man in the back of the crowd with his arms folded, who looked like he hadn't come for the auction. He was tall enough that she could see him over the heads of the men in front of him, broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas coat that had seen too many seasons, his dark hair going grey at the temples. He wasn't watching Aldous. He was watching her. She looked away. Aldous began listing her father's debts. The numbers were staggering. Nora focused on a point just above the crowd's heads, a crooked wither vein on the livery roof, and tried to breathe evenly. The bidding started low. A cattle agent from out of town opened at $40. She didn't know what that was supposed to cover. Her labor, presumably. Her presence in someone's household. Her ability to cook and clean and keep quiet. The thought made her stomach turn hard as a river stone. A man near the front called out, 60. Someone else raised it to 75. Nora had stopped listening to their voices and started listening to the wind instead, the way it moved through the gaps between the buildings, the way it carried the smell of pine down from the mountains to the west. She didn't hear the new voice at first. She heard the crowd shift, a murmur, a few heads turning, and then she heard Aldous go quiet mid-sentence, which was not something Aldous seemed capable of. The voice came from the back, low, not particularly loud, the kind of voice that didn't need to be. Nora turned her head. The man with the grey-streaked hair had unfolded his arms. He was reaching into his coat. He set a leather pouch on the wagon board beside Aldous without climbing up. He was tall enough that he didn't need to, and looked at the creditor with an expression that wasn't quite a challenge and wasn't quite a question. It was simply a statement. "We're done here." Aldous opened the pouch. He counted. He counted again. Nobody in the crowd said anything for a long moment. "Sold," Aldous said, finally, and his voice had lost about half its confidence. The man looked at Nora then, not the way the cattle agent had looked at her, not the way the crowd had looked at her. He looked at her the way you look at someone you're about to say something difficult to, and you want to make sure they're listening. "My name is Cade," he said. "I have a cabin 2 hours north. It's not much, but nobody will bother you there." Nora stared at him. "I don't need anything from you," he added, "in case that's what you're thinking." It was exactly what she'd been thinking. She picked up the small bag at her feet, everything she'd managed to grab before Aldous's men had locked the store, and she followed him to where his horse was tied. He didn't help her up. He didn't ignore her either. He just untied the horse and handed her the reins, of a second animal, a stocky grey mare she hadn't noticed until now, and she understood that he'd brought it for her. He'd known, somehow, or planned for the possibility. She wasn't sure which was stranger. They rode north without talking. The silence between them wasn't the silence of strangers pretending to be comfortable. It was the silence of two people with nothing to explain yet, which was different. Nora kept her eyes on the trail ahead and tried to take stock of what she actually knew. A man named Cade. A cabin. 2 hours north. The statement. She had no reason to believe him. She believed him anyway. She wasn't sure if that was trust or just exhaustion. The cabin sat in a fold of the mountain, sheltered on 3 sides by old-growth pine. It was small, 1 room, a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace that took up most of 1 wall. Clean, though, sparse but deliberate. Someone had taken care to think through how to live here. Cade unsaddled both horses without being asked. Nora stood in the doorway and looked at the interior. A wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of tools and, unexpectedly, 3 books. She crossed to the shelf and tilted her head to read the spines. A Bible, a surveying manual, and, she almost smiled, a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe. "You can have the loft," Cade said from behind her. He was carrying both saddles. He didn't look at the shelf. "There's blankets in the chest." She turned around. "Why did you do it?" He set the saddles down by the door. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, which surprised her. She'd expected a brush-off, or a short answer that closed the subject. "I've been coming through Caldwell Flats for 12 years, he said. "I knew your father a little. He was a fair man." He paused. "And I've seen that kind of auction go badly before. That's not a reason to spend $150. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He didn't add anything else. He picked up an axe from beside the door and went back outside. She stood in the cabin and listened to the sound of wood splitting, steady and unhurried, and couldn't decide what to do with any of it. She made dinner. It seemed like the only practical response. She found dried beans and salt pork and a cast-iron pot that had been seasoned properly, which told her more about Cade than anything he'd said so far. A man who didn't know how to cook didn't bother seasoning his cookware. He came in when it was getting dark, knocked the snow off his boots outside the door, and sat down at the table without ceremony. She set a bowl in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I have to do something," she said. "I can't just sit." He seemed to understand that. He picked up the spoon. They ate without talking. The fire popped, the wind had come up outside, and the pine trees moved against each other with a sound like water. "The grey mare's name is Fern," Cade said at some point. "She's easier in the mornings if you talk to her first." Nora looked up. "She gets nervous in new situations," he said, as if this were entirely ordinary information to share. "I'll keep that in mind," Nora said. It was the closest thing to a real conversation they had that first week. She learned the shape of his days without asking. He was up before dawn. He checked the trap lines north of the cabin on Mondays and Thursdays. He spent the middle of the day cutting wood or working on whatever needed fixing. There was always something. He cooked when she didn't. He didn't seem to have a preference either way. He didn't interfere with her, and he didn't ignore her, which she slowly came to understand was its own kind of consideration. He'd built shelves she hadn't noticed at first, low ones along the wall beside the wood stove. Within a week, she'd filled 2 of them with jars she'd found empty in the cellar, packed now with dried herbs and the rose hips she'd gathered from the south-facing slope above the cabin. He didn't comment on this, but one evening she came inside and found that he'd added a 3rd shelf without telling her. She didn't say anything either, but she was grateful for it. The trouble came at the end of the 2nd week, which was sooner than she'd hoped and exactly when she'd feared. She was coming back from the creek with a bucket of water when she heard horses on the lower trail. 2 riders, moving slow the way people move when they're looking for something rather than going somewhere. She set the bucket down behind the woodpile and watched from between the one in front. She recognized the cattle agent from the auction. He'd lost the bid, and apparently he hadn't made peace with it. His name was Pike. She'd heard someone call him that in the crowd at Caldwell Flats. He was the kind of man who wore his grievances in his posture, and his posture right now said he'd been thinking about this for 2 weeks. Cade came out of the cabin before Pike had dismounted. He'd heard them too, somehow. He stood on the step with his arms at his sides and said nothing. "I want to talk to the woman," Pike said. "She doesn't want to talk to you," Cade said. "You don't know that." "I do." Pike looked past him toward the cabin door. His companion stayed on horseback, which meant he was there for size, not action. This was a conversation. Pike thought he could win with words. "She was on the block," Pike said. "Fair auction. Aldous can only sell what the debtor put up, and I don't think a man can put up his daughter as a debt settlement. I've been asking around. Legally speaking, that sale might not hold." Cade was quiet for a moment. "Is that right?" he said. "That's right. Which means she's not yours, and she's not bound to stay. She knows that," Cade said. "She's stayed anyway." Nora, watching from behind the woodpile, felt something move in her chest. She hadn't thought about it in quite those terms before. She'd stayed because she had nowhere else to go. That was what she'd told herself. But Cade had just said it plainly, without asking her to be grateful for it, without making it a claim. She'd stayed anyway. Like it was simply a fact, like it was hers. She stepped out from behind the woodpile. Both men looked at her. Pike's expression shifted, recalculating. "I'll stay," she said. She looked at Pike directly. "Whatever the legal question is, the answer is the same. I'll stay." Pike stared at her for a long moment. Then he gathered his reins. "Waste of a woman," he said, and turned his horse down the trail. Cade watched them go until they were out of sight. Then he turned and looked at Nora. She expected him to say something. Thank her, maybe, or acknowledge what she'd done. He went back inside and put the kettle on. She followed him in. He set 2 cups on the table. She sat down. It was a small thing, the kettle. It was a small thing, the 2 cups. But Nora had spent enough of her life in a general store watching people negotiate the distance between themselves to know that most of what mattered between people was communicated in small things. He'd made cups, without asking, without discussion, without the performance of consideration. She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at the fire. "What happens when the snow gets bad?" she asked. "We stay in," he said. "For how long?" "Depends on the winter." He looked into his own cup. "Last year, 12 days straight." She thought about 12 days in a one-room cabin with a man who said almost nice, she asked. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, the near cousin of one. "A little," he said. She laughed. It surprised both of them. The sound of it, sudden and real in the small room. She put her hand over her mouth, and the laugh became something else, not quite tears, but close. She'd been holding a lot of things very carefully for 3 weeks, and something had just slipped. Cade didn't look away. He didn't try to fix it or redirect it, or tell her she was all right. He just sat there, which was exactly what she needed him to do, and after a moment she took her hand away from her mouth and breathed. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. The winter came early and hard that year. The first big snow arrived in October, and it didn't stop for 4 days. They were not 12 days confined together, but they were close. Nora learned that Cade read at night. Not the Bible, not the surveying manual, but Robinson Crusoe, which he'd apparently read enough times that he could open it to any page. She learned that he had been a surveyor before whatever had happened to bring him to this mountain, though he didn't say what that was, and she didn't ask. She learned that he woke once in the night, every night, and lay still for a few minutes before going back to sleep, as if he was checking on something. She didn't know what. He learned that she could fix a broken axe, handle better than he could, which seemed to genuinely surprise him, and that she wrote in it. She kept a small journal, and that she wrote in it every morning, without fail, which he respected without comment. Never asking what she wrote, he learned, she thought, that she was watching all of this, watching him, and he didn't mind. One morning in November, she came down from the loft to find him already gone. The wood stove was banked, and there was a note on the table which was unusual. He'd never left a note before. Sleep too. Traplines longer today. Back by dark. There's a lame ewe in the lean-to. She won't give you trouble. She looked at the note for a long time. He'd been building that lean-to for a week. She'd thought it was for wood storage. She looked out the window at the small structure now dusted with snow and understood. He'd built it for an animal. An animal he'd apparently acquired at some point. Without mentioning it, she pulled on her coat and went out. The ewe was a small brown thing with an injured back left leg, bound with a strip of clean cloth. She looked up at Nora with a complete lack of alarm, which meant she was accustomed to people. She was also, unmistakably, pregnant. Nora crouched down and looked at the leg. The binding was tight and clean and correct. Cade had done it carefully. She put her hand out and the ewe pressed her nose against Nora's palm. "You have terrible timing," Nora told her. The ewe did not disagree. He came back at dusk as he'd said. She had dinner on. She didn't say anything about the ewe immediately. She waited until he'd sat down and then she said, "She's pretty far along." He looked up. "The ewe," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Found her on the north slope. Leg was caught in a root. She'd been there a while." He looked back down at his bowl. "Figured she'd be better in here than out." "She is," Nora said. "I checked the leg. You did it right." He looked up again, held her gaze for a moment. "You know sheep," he said. "My grandmother." "Kept them?" she said. "I'll be there when she delivers." It was the most certain she'd felt about anything since her father died. She wasn't sure what that said about her. But she'd stopped questioning what helped and what didn't. The ewe helped. The shelf for her jars helped. The kettle and the 2 cups helped. The lambs came on a Tuesday night in late November, 3 weeks ahead of anyone's expectation, during a storm that would have killed them in the open. Nora was in the lean-to with a lantern. For 3 hours, Cade came out twice to check on her and bring more dry straw. And both times she sent him back inside. The 3rd time she came in herself in the grey hours at the table. And he was still awake at the table. She sat down across from him. "2," she said, "both doing well." He let out a breath. She hadn't realized he'd been holding it. "Good," he said. She looked at him in the lamplight, the tiredness around his eyes, the way he'd been sitting there in the dark, waiting, not wanting to be in the way and not wanting to be too far either. She'd seen her father look like that, sitting up when her mother was sick, the specific kind of worry that holds itself very still. "Cade," she said. He looked at her. She didn't have a question. She wasn't sure she had words for what she meant. But she held his gaze, and after a moment he nodded, just slightly, and she thought that was probably enough. They were not people who needed a great deal of words. She got up and poured water into the kettle. He didn't say she didn't have to. He got 2 cups from the shelf. By December, the people in Caldwell Flats had mostly stopped talking about Nora and the mountain man who'd bought her at Aldous's settlement auction. The story had run its course the way stories do in small towns, burning fast and cooling off, leaving behind nothing but a few people who claimed they'd known all along how it would go. None of them knew. By December, Nora had moved the surveying manual from the shelf to the table and was working her way through it. Cade, returning from the trap line one afternoon to find her bent over a page of triangulation calculations, with a look of focused irritation, said nothing. He sat down across from her. He watched her work through the problem. When she got stuck and sat back, he pointed to a line 3 paragraphs up that she'd skimmed past. She read it again. She saw it. She went back to the calculation and worked it out. "Got it," she said. "Yeah?" he said. She looked up. His face was doing the almost smile thing again. She'd gotten good at reading it. The slight easing around the eyes, the stillness that wasn't quite neutral anymore. She'd catalogued more expressions on Cade's face in 3 months than she'd catalogued on most people in 3 years. That was what happened when you lived in close quarters with someone quiet. You learned to read the small print. She held his gaze. "Thank you," she said. "For the shelf." He looked at her for a moment. "Which one?" he said. She considered. "All of them?" He was quiet. Then, "You're not going back to Caldwell Flats." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was, she understood, a statement of what he hoped, said as plainly as he was capable of saying it, which, for Cade, was the most direct form of vulnerability available. She closed the surveying manual. "No," she said, "I'm not." Outside, the snow had started again. It came down steady and silent against the window, and the 2 lambs were tucked warm in the lean-to, and the kettle was already on.